teach-in on spatial apartheid, histories and ongoing realities of spatial inequalities in Palestine and South Africa. My name is Tara Weinberg, and I'm a lecturer in the Wits History Department, where my focus is on histories of struggles over land in South Africa. I'll be facilitating this teach-in and introducing our speakers. This teach-in is co-organized by South African Jews for a Free Palestine, the Wits University Palestine Solidarity Committee, and the Wits Student Palestine Solidarity Committee, the PSC. To situate our teach-in, I'd like to begin with a brief reading from a book by Ilan Pape, A History of Modern Palestine, published in 2004. And he says, quote, "From my classroom at Haifa University, up on the mountains, there is seldom a clear view of the city below. On a rare day when smog and pollution are miraculously absent, I can see the Jewish and Palestinian neighborhoods of Haifa. Socioeconomic well-being is closely entwined with national and ethnic affiliations and topography. This forms a pyramid which encapsulates the stratification of Israeli society and, more importantly, the history of the land. Given this geographical polity, it is not surprising to find the university at the top of the mountain, marked by a tower and 30 stories, overlooking the Palestinians, Mizrahi Jews, and the less fortunate socioeconomic classes of the town. Like all other national institutions in Israel, the community of Haifa University is predominantly Jewish, European, and middle class," end quote. It struck me reading this that Pape could well be describing a university like Wits or UCT, looking down from a hill upon segregated neighborhoods that we so associate with South African apartheid-shaped cities like Johannesburg or Cape Town. Both Palestine and South Africa have legacies of settler colonialism, accompanied by the accumulation of property, particularly land, by white settlers. In both places, too, people waged struggles against these structural inequalities wrought by settler colonialism and fought for a more just distribution of property, including land and housing. And in both places, these struggles are ongoing. This teach-in brings together Palestinian scholar activists with South African lawyers, researchers, and activists who are working towards land, spatial, and housing justice. Their inputs offer us the chance to share knowledge and possibilities for solidarity as we seek to dismantle the legacies of spatial apartheid. After the speakers have offered their inputs, we invite you to offer your comments and questions. And so that way, this teach-in is a collaborative space for sharing knowledge with an eye to action. I'll now introduce the speakers. Rawan Masri graduated with honors from the University of Southern California with a BA double majoring in Middle East Studies and Political Science. She currently works as a translator for the Palestinian Museum. She lives in Ramallah with her husband Fathi, with whom she co-founded decolonizepalestine.com, which is an incredible collection of resources for organizers and those wishing to learn more about Palestine. She is also at Birzeit University student in the MA Critical Cultural Studies program. Fathi Nimer is a policy fellow at Al-Shabaka, the Palestine Policy Network. He previously worked as a research associate with the Arab World for Research and Development, as a teaching fellow at Birzeit University, and a program officer with the Ramallah Center for Human Rights Studies. Fathi holds a master's degree in political science from Heidelberg University and is the co-founder of decolonizepalestine.com. His current focus is on political economy, contentious politics, food sovereignty, agroecology, and the resistance economy in Palestine. Khululiwe Bhengu is a senior attorney at SERI, the Socioeconomic Rights Institute of South Africa, a public interest law firm here in Johannesburg. SERI works to develop and implement strategies to challenge inequality and realize socioeconomic rights. Khululiwe's practice particularly concerns protecting the rights of persons facing unlawful evictions, as well as informal or precarious workers in waste reclaiming and informal trade, with a particular focus on the rights to work and adequate housing. Rashid Seedat is the executive director of the Gauteng City Regional Observatory, the GCRO. The GCRO was established in 2008 as a partnership between the University of Johannesburg, Wits University and the Gauteng provincial government to conduct research on towns and cities in the Gauteng city region and provide policy support to government. Rashid has a long history of involvement in urban struggles and work on urban development and local government, starting out as an activist in the 1980s. Before joining the GCRO, he headed the Gauteng Planning Division in the Office of the Premier between 2011 and 2021. And he was also head of the Central Strategy Unit in the Executive Mayor's Office at the City of Johannesburg for 10 years. So thank you very much to our speakers who are giving the first inputs in this teaching. And I will hand over to Rawan and Fathi.
All right. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for the wonderful invitation that allowed us to be here. We're very honored and humbled to be, supported to be able to come here and talk to all of you lovely people. Okay, so when we talk about Palestine and urban planning and the infrastructure and all these inequalities and tactics used by settler colonialism to kind of displace people or keep people of a certain class or ethnicity segregated from others, I think what a lot of people fall into the trap is looking at Palestine in a segmented way. And this has been kind of reinforced over almost 100 years of the segmentation of Palestinian society. We have people in the West Bank. We have people in the Gaza Strip. We have people in East Jerusalem, and we have Palestinians inside Palestine 48, which is called today Israel. And obviously, you have Palestinians in the diaspora. We have come to naturalize and kind of digest these differences as if they're a natural part of Palestinians. This is not the case, and this is definitely not how Israel operates. Israel operates from the river to the sea because that's how its tactics align. That's how it wants to, exert its control. But at the same time, we can't talk about this kind of infrastructure without looking at these separate regions, because each of these regions has a very specific context. Settler colonialism in the West Bank looks radically different from settler colonialism, for example, in 48, because the tactics are different, the contexts are different, the people are different. So I know that the title is supposedly about Jerusalem, but I would like to open up a little bit about the West Bank and then about Palestine 48, and then in the end, I will tie it all back in Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is this strange kind of context in Palestine that has a mixed kind of governance system that takes aspects from the West Bank, from 48, and from many other places. And I'm sure a lot of these tactics will sound very familiar to you as South Africans, and especially if you've lived, through the apartheid, anti-apartheid struggle. So, as you are all well aware, colonialism does not operate through force alone. I mean, we can talk about institutional violence and legal violence, but there's also these kinds of soft forms of violence. So the legal system is a very strong and very important part of how apartheid functions in Palestine. And I think a lot of the issues drawing parallels to apartheid in Palestine and South Africa is that each region is radically different in how apartheid is practiced. So you'll have people in 48 that don't have the open segregation like was in South Africa. Like you'll see, oh, here's a Muslim and a Jew sitting together. Why is there apartheid? But that's obviously not the definition of apartheid. And South Africa, while the premier example of apartheid, is not the only form of apartheid. So it doesn't need to be open segregation. If we look at Rhodesia, for example, well, it was called Rhodesia, they had Black parliament members, but it was still an apartheid state because in the constitution it said this is a state for the white people and for the benefit of the white people. So when Israelis, for example, say that they're Palestinian parliament members, that's not, it has nothing to do with the actual international law definition of what apartheid means. So coming back to urban planning, when we talk about the West Bank, the Oslo Accords in the mid-90s kind of dissected the West Bank into three administrative zones. There are areas A, which are under complete Palestinian control. There are areas C, which are under complete Israeli control. And there's areas B in the middle, which is kind of a mix, which has Palestinian civil control, but Israeli security control. That means police, if you have any issues like fire and all these kind of administrative things that are not civil. So the majority of the West Bank is Area C. So it's under complete Israeli control. And what does this mean in practice is that if Palestinians want to do anything in Area C, they need to apply for a permit. Permits are rejected 99% of the time. I think it's a little bit higher, I think 99.2 or something like that, but let's be generous and give them 1%. So what this means functionally is that if you want to get married, you want to move out, you can't build a house. You cannot expand your house even. If you have a functioning, you can't even expand it. To the point where you can't even build an extra room or an extra wall. You can't dig a water well, for example. The water is completely controlled by the occupation. So what this is doing, it's because also Area C is rural mostly, and it's very sparsely populated. So the Israeli tactic is to kind of concentrate the Palestinians in their little villages and to keep the vast countryside with all the agricultural areas and all the water sources to keep them up for control. And this comes in multiple, forms. Annexations, they can say this land needs to be annexed for security reasons or for the benefit of the state. There's nothing you can do to appeal, of course. There's settlements that are constructed on these lands. And when we talk settlements, it's important to understand that we're not talking about the physical settlement only. Every settlement has a huge perimeter around it. They call it the security perimeter. It is massive. So even if a settlement is just 20 houses or such, there's a whole mountain that's now gone because you need to have a security parameter around it. You need to have fencing. You need to have an army. If the army wants to function, it needs roads. They're going to dig special roads that are only for these settlers and only for Israelis. So this is kind of like a very open segregation in the West Bank. Israeli settlers live by civil law. Their neighbors, well, not really neighbors because they don't consider them, the same kind of people. The people living next to them, Palestinians are treated under military courts. So in Israeli military courts, which has a 99.7 conviction rate, which means that no matter what you're accused of, you're going to go to jail, no matter what. This is why we have such a high number of Palestinian prisoners. We're talking about, I don't remember, like over 12,000 or something more right now.
We have an article in the Scalawag magazine, if anyone's interested more about prisoner rights
Yeah.
specifically. And we have more numbers of it. I think it's like over 1 million Palestinians since the occupation have been in prison.
Yeah. It's almost impossible to find a Palestinian family who doesn't have someone in prison.
Yeah.
So this is one aspect of how villages are kind of cut off in the West Bank. Of course, you all know about the checkpoints between big communities to kind of cordon off. Like Ramallah is supposedly the biggest, the capital, quote unquote, of the Palestinian Authority. It has 2 checkpoints, and if they close, nobody can move around. Hundreds of thousands of people will stay stuck where they are. It's just a small gate, but this is part of the control. And Moshe Dayan, an Israeli general, after he took over the West Bank in '67, he said, if all the services of Palestinians, from electricity to water, come from us, then this is more effective than all the army. And this is true. Because if they can cut off the water, they can cut off the electricity. This is a more effective control tactic than actually needing troops on the ground, which of course they also do have, but it's a combination. This is one aspect. And the thing is, Area C does not only count for rural areas. Some areas of Ramallah, for example, are also called Area C because this was drafted almost 30 years ago when everything looked radically different on the ground. What happens is that there's an area, for example, in Ramallah called Kufr Aqab, and it is not allowed to have Palestinian police in it because it's Area C, and Israel refuses to send police there. Israel refuses to fix the streets because that's under Israeli control. Every year, Kufr Aqab drowns in the rain because Israel refuses to let Palestinians build a sewage system there. So every year, the people of Kufr Aqab literally have to swim through the streets to get to work every day. And the Palestinian Authority has said multiple times, hey, can you help us? We want to, just give us a permit. We'll do it. We'll pay for everything. They reject. They do not want to do that. They want to make life as difficult as possible for Palestinians so that they voluntarily evacuate these areas. And these areas, specifically Area C, are part of something called the Alon Plan, which was came up with a general called Alon after the '67 war to place settlements in strategic areas as to confine Palestinians into little small cantons, even smaller on the level than a Bantustan. They're like even subunits inside of a Bantustan. So all of this annexation, all this difficulty, all these checkpoints has actually led to the politicization of the Palestinian population. They are forced to become cheap labor inside Israel because that's the only thing that pays anymore. Because Palestinians, in general, we're an agrarian society. We rely on agriculture. But when your farms keep getting annexed, entire ways of life are changed. And to go inside and work inside, you need to pass a security check. So that's another control mechanism to keep you from resisting or doing anything against the occupation. If you are married, you actually have an easier time applying for a security check. That's because you're less of a threat, according to them. So what that led to also, it's a knock-on effect, is that young laborers are deciding not to go to school, not to go to education, get married like at 18 or 17, and just apply for a permit because it pays better than anything else that's available to them. So we see like every single little like facet of control has a knock-on effect that tumbles like a domino effect on everything. Like even it's going to change going forward. Of course, this is measured like in decades and like more than that. So you can't see the effects right away. But this is all going to have a demographic effect, economic effect. All of this is going to be seen in the future, not right now. So this is just a very small thing about the West Bank. And the West Bank is maybe the easiest example to say this is apartheid, similar to the South Africa model, for example. Of course, there are caveats. It's never a one-to-one model. But apartheid inside 48, which is officially called the State of Israel, also has very different characteristics because Palestinians inside 48 are citizens. But there's a trick to this because according to Israeli law, there is a distinction between a citizen and a national. And your rights mostly come from your nationality, not your citizenship. And your nationality is based on your ethnicity. So you're an Israeli citizen, but you're a Druze national, or you're an Arab national, or you're a Jewish national. A lot of your rights come down to what your nationality is, not your citizenship. There are some broad rights, like the right to elect, for example, but Adala, which is a Palestinian organization within 48, has something called a discrimination database. Has a database of all the discriminatory laws in Israel, and every time I look at it, there's new laws, unfortunately. When I first started talking about this, there were 25 laws. Now we're talking about over 60. It's been only 20 years, so I mean, they're going at a fast pace. So this is one aspect of how there's discrimination de jure through law. But there's also de facto discrimination and segregation. Did you know that about 80% of all land within Israel is off limits for non-Jewish people? You cannot lease land there, you cannot live land there. And this is accomplished not through an outright ban on Palestinians, but through planning and through different legal tactics. For example, the Israeli government gave a huge proportion of state land to the JNF, the Jewish National Fund. And the Jewish National Fund in its charter says that it is for the benefit of the Jewish people only. So when the JNF rejects an application for leasing or for buying land from an Arab, they say, oh, sorry, for Jews only. And the Israeli state says, oh, we're not discriminating. This is the JNF, this is their mandate, we can't do anything about it. So there's no like legal way that they're saying this is a ban for Arabs, for example, but in fact, in practice, it practically is. And this also goes to the so-called admissions committee. Every community in 48 has a kind of like, I don't know, like a homeowners association type thing, like a community admissions to see if the new person coming in fits with the character. The justification in general is that, you know, if it's a secular community, they don't want an ultra-Orthodox person, or if it's an ultra-Orthodox community, they don't want secular people and so forth. But what this translates into in practice, total segregation between Jews and non-Jews. There is almost no town, like there are a few mixed cities in Israel, but outside of that, the vast majority of the land is actually segregated through these kinds of admissions communities. And there's really, government says, well, there's no legal, it's against the Constitution. Well, they don't really have a Constitution, they have a basic law, but it's against the basic law to discriminate. So we don't do that, but they kind of, you know, give this discrimination to all these other actors to do the discrimination for them. And that's how Israeli society is constructed. It's not a bug, it's a feature. It was on purpose done that way. This is not even to count the huge disparity in the resource allocation. We're talking about the majority of Palestinians inside Israel actually live below the poverty line. They're way overrepresented in poverty compared to their Jewish neighbors. Welfare overwhelmingly targets Jewish neighbors instead of Palestinians. This is a completely, of course, they don't call them Palestinians, they call them Arab Israelis because they don't want to admit that there's something called a Palestinian. So this is the rule of law, basically, which plays a much bigger role in 48 than a military force. And since the establishment of the state in 48, there have been 600 Jewish communities built in, villages and communities, kibbutz, whatever. There has not been a single non-Jewish one. even though they represent over 20% of the population. Palestinians in 48 represent 20% of the population. They were miraculously spared from the ethnic cleansing in 48 for multiple reasons, some of them political, some of them logistical, but that's not the issue right now. Someone is ready to say, oh, well, but we have millions of Arabs in Israel. It's like, do you want a cookie for not ethnically cleansing 100%? You only ethnically cleansed 80%. Like, that's what they're saying. Like, oh, we have a judge. Okay, well, Mandela was a lawyer, a very successful lawyer also. Like, being part of this system does not mean it's not an apartheid system. Having segregated schools, I think there's like only 5 non-segregated schools within 48. And it's also all segregated, not through law, but through these little admissions communities. So this is just a general idea of how it is in 48. Now, I left Jerusalem till last because Jerusalem is kind of a weird mishmash between 48 and between the West Bank. So Jerusalem was officially annexed in the 80s. It was occupied in 67. Okay, I need to go a little bit more. The western half of it was occupied in 48. The eastern half was occupied in 67. So after this occupation happened, they said there's a reunification of the city. Now, finally, Jerusalem is back to being the capital of the Jewish people. But there's also a lot of caveats because East Jerusalem, although they annexed it legally to Israel, illegally internationally, they do not treat Palestinians living there as citizens. They treat them as residents, and they give them residency cards. And these residency cards are a form of control that can be revoked for any reason possible. They have a law called the Jerusalem as a Center of Life law that only basically in practice applies to Palestinians. It doesn't apply to, because they're the only residents there. They say, if Jerusalem stops being the center of your life, then you will lose your residency and have to go live in the West Bank or abroad. What does center of life mean? If you go to study abroad for 1 year, and you don't report everything, you are losing your home. That's it. If you don't pay insurance in a certain way, in a certain time in Jerusalem, they say, oh, well, you're not paying Jerusalem. That means that you moved outside. If you move to live in Ramallah, because a lot of Jerusalemites move to live to Ramallah because they work in Ramallah, for example, or in Birzeit, or they go to school in Ramallah, because they're very close. The whole land is so tiny. It's actually ridiculous. I live 30 minutes away from Jerusalem, but I'm not allowed to go there. I can see the sea from my house, but I'm not allowed to go there. It's absolutely ridiculous how small everything is. But it's made so difficult with all these security controls and checkpoints and the space scanners and all these kinds of systems. So what happened in Jerusalem is that in the 73, they were worried about the Palestinian population growing too much. So there was a ministerial committee called the Gaffney Committee. One of the ministers called Gaffney, he was leading the committee. And it decided that the Palestinian population in Jerusalem should not go above 30%. Could you imagine any city in the world saying a certain ethnicity must not go upon us? Oh, I mean, you're South Africans, you can imagine, I'm sure. Like, I'm sorry, like I'm preaching the quote. I'm used to talking to Americans, I'm sorry. So you've lived there, you're not just imagine it. So we have an area, a neighborhood called Sheikh Jarrah, which they have been slowly trying to get people out through this legal warfare and through forging of house deeds. I don't know if you remember in 2021, there were the Sheikh Jarrah events and Muhammad al-Kurd became very prominent as the spokesperson for Palestinians. This is the neighborhood. And actually when we came to South Africa last year, and we went to the District 6 Museum in Cape Town, and the parallels were actually ridiculous. How these like warrants are given, you have to evacuate your house in a year, and then we'll come, take it over, destroying neighborhoods. There was a whole neighborhood called the Moroccan neighborhood in Jerusalem that was completely destroyed and was made into a big worship area near the Kotel, the wall. There was a kind of a repurposing of Jerusalem, kind of re-engineering it, where the Arab neighborhoods were very, very underfunded, Arab Palestinian neighborhoods, and the Israeli ones kept blossoming. They've built settlements, they call them neighborhoods in Jerusalem. They built new settlements in Jerusalem to kind of affect the demographic buildup. Israel is obsessed with demographics. I mean, they call Palestinian children demographic threats. Like, this is the level of dehumanization we're living with, we have been living with for nearly a century. Discrimination goes even deeper. Like, we're talking about Palestinians right now are 37% of the population of Jerusalem. So their plan failed, thankfully, but they're still working on it. crimes that would not get an Israeli like 1 year in jail would get a Palestinian evicted from the city. Things like not paying, like having checks, like bouncing, or stuff like that, like ridiculously small things. They're looking for any excuse to kick out Palestinians. And for the last 30 years or so, they'll be kicking out 100 families per year. And it's only going up now with Bhengu. And of course, they're not allowed to expand their homes. They're not even allowed to renovate their homes. So if something is falling apart, you have to do it in secret at night to try and fix it. And if they catch you, they will tear it down. And if your house gets destroyed in the process, perfect. Now you have nowhere to go, leave. This is how they do, that's the urban planning. The municipalities are very discriminatory. There's a new light rail system unveiled in Jerusalem. It's kind of a tram, like a futuristic tram that you see in these like sci-fi movies. It only goes through Jewish neighborhoods. That's because they don't want them to go with them in the morning or to go with them like to work and such. So it's 20 different layers of kind of legal discrimination built upon state violence, built upon cultural violence. Like cultural institutions, Palestinian cultural institutions have almost no funding in Jerusalem, even though Palestinians are 37% of the population. I think their municipal share of resources is like 10%. And everything else goes to, of course, the Jewish neighborhoods. And when then they show you pictures like, oh, look at the Palestinians, they have trash in the street. Well, yeah, we don't have a municipality to help do anything. And then they show you Jewish neighbors like pristine and clean and all that. It's like, this is planned. This is not, because all Palestinians are backwards. They don't know how to clean their neighborhoods. It's because there's no infrastructure. There's no kind of fairness in how anything is given out. And we don't expect fairness, obviously. It's not like we want to be equal members of a colonial society. We want to have actual, freedom and decolonization for everyone. So I'm sorry, I believe I went a little bit over time, but these are just basically. Oh yeah, and if they destroy your house, you have to pay for it too, because you are taking resources away from the municipality. So either you destroy it with your own hands, or you have to pay the municipality to bring a bulldozer to destroy your own house. And that is something that I hope never to experience, or for nobody to really experience, but this is reality. In Area C also, this is the reality. Also in 48, to a lesser extent, this is the reality. So I think in conclusion, I think it's dangerous to ascribe like what the situation is like in Palestine, because there are multiple situations in multiple places. But at the same time, we should think about this all as this part of the same system of settler colonialism that wants to make Palestinians basically disappear. And the Gaza Strip obviously has a very difficult also context, especially being under siege for the last 17 years or so. But I will leave that to Rawan to talk more about the situation in Gaza and the humanitarian aid theater that is going on. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Is there a way I can connect to the net? Or
Let me connect you to my.
sorry, I should check that sooner, but I was charging.
No problem.
Just quickly, this isn't specifically about Palestine, because what Fathi mentioned about the idea of if there are individuals who manage to, despite a discriminatory system, find some success or a career or get educated, the idea that that means that there isn't racism. I always think about Paul Robeson. There's a video of him in a hearing in the US when they were doing the McCarthyist anti-communist shakedowns. And he was asked, oh, but you go to Columbia University and you're a successful footballer and you're Black. How could you say that there's still segregation? And his answer to that, I think, is really brilliant. I definitely recommend listening to it. Oh, that's the hotspot.
Where is it? And it's not connecting to.
affecting the internet?
No.
We were using my hotspot. Let me just try
I
again.
tried connected to Edgeroom.
Oh, okay. Good. We could just connect on my phone if you need.
Oh, yeah, we could do that. Oh, okay.
Okay, there we go. So I just want to preface this by saying I'm not an infrastructure expert or some sort of expert on ports and piers in this, but I think this was just important to talk about as it's something I've been following, just generally trying to push back against the US narrative that the US is trying their best to get in humanitarian aid, but unfortunately Netanyahu is just so irrational. I think it's very important to be cognizant of that, especially since it seems to be really dominant framing in a lot of, especially US media, but English language media in general. And as you know, as Fathi described, this humanitarian aid theater. So it's in this context, what I'll be talking about. And I start with this image, this action that was taking place recently in Gaza that Gazan citizens were forced to see, which is that for so many of them, they had family under the rubble who were still alive, who slowly suffocated or starved under the rubble for several hours, who could have been saved had heavy machinery been allowed to enter the strip to remove the rubble. Instead, we have thousands who are under the rubble who still have not been properly buried. And what people in Gaza saw instead was the entrance of trucks of this heavy machinery, picking up the rubble, quite literally mixed with the corpses of their loved ones, and taking the rubble to build this so-called US humanitarian port endeavor. So that's, I think, just really the epitome of how this infrastructure, these plans are done around and against Palestinians and not with their best interests in mind. And I think what's especially egregious about this is that Gaza actually really needs a port. They were supposed to have one. They were supposed to have a seaport and airport from the Oslo Accords. We're talking, 30 years ago. And in 2000, there had actually something that has started to be built, but it was destroyed by Israel. And even since then, Israel had told donors that, oh, we won't interfere if you start building things. But really, they were kind of other machinations, ways that they managed to prevent this from happening. So now it seems like it'll be happening, but in order to enact further control over Gaza. And when these donors were told, this was after the settlement withdrawal in 2005. So what we know so far, and there's still, Pentagon plans that are unclear to us at this point, but we know that it's been announced that there'll be at least 500 to 1,000 American soldiers taking part. Biden, in his State of the Union address, kept clarifying, or US statements since then have been trying to differentiate by saying that they won't be on shore, but they'll be on the pier and the floating dock. And obviously this kind of raises a lot of questions in terms of this being a step towards US occupation, or really just like a trick of language. Like, what do you mean they're not on shore, but they're on the floating dock? They're still there. And something else that we've come to realize in terms of where it's being built, this maritime corridor south of Gaza City, is it seems to line up with the Israeli military's ongoing establishment of a highway across the Gaza Strip, separating the north from the south. It's what the Israelis refer to as the Netzarim corridor. It's a 2-kilometer wide road and buffer zone. It's a significant area historically in terms of one of the most enduring images, for example, of the Second Intifada was Mohammed al-Dura, a small child who his father was attempting to shield him from Israeli gunfire, these massacres that was taking place at this area. And he was killed. There's actually something to be said that Mohammed al-Dura's father survived since that point, and he's since lost 2 more children in this war alone. So, but we know what this area is, and as some satellite imagery has kind of revealed, it seems that the way it's being built, it will be able to ease raids into the camps in the middle area, into the south, into the north. Horrific raids, like as we're seeing in Shifa Hospital, which was under siege for days, and all the mass executions and arrests that have been happening there. And something else that we know is that the discussion of how long it would take for this pier to be operational would be 60 days. We're talking mid-May. And the idea is that, or what we're being told is there will be 2 million meals per day and all these things. But what a lot of aid organizations are saying is that it's quite unclear to them how this aid is supposed to be distributed. And it's increasingly become clear that it's to undermine UNRWA further, besides the smear campaign against UNRWA that has resulted in all this funding being withdrawn. And it's really, as you can even see from kind of more explicit these statements, it's part of the blockade. It's not circumventing it. It's supposed to really supplant, not recent, not since the beginning of the war, but aid networks that have been in place for 75 years since refugees came to the Gaza Strip. As maybe some of you know, most of Gaza are refugees. Over 70% were ethnically cleansed from their homes in the Nakba in 1948. A lot of them from villages in the area now, militaristically, euphemistically known as the Gaza envelope. And so we see this kind of scenario of wanting to take over these aid networks and really preparing for a situation in the future where they're militarily there's no Hamas, and instead it'll be kind of these other things. And what we've seen is this is kind of in connection to the killing of aid workers. And even recently, Israel attempted to reach out to certain prominent families in the Gaza Strip and kind of set up really like a mafioso situation of having these families control aid, trying to, through money or power, convince certain families to do so. These families actually refuse. And what we've since seen then has been the targeted assassination of the heads of these families. And this is also part of the way that aid distribution has been talked about in general. The infamous flower massacre, which really has since become flower massacres. This idea that there's such chaos and nobody knows who's shooting, which is untrue, really. It's part of these systemic attempts to present it as if there's no other way for aid to get in other than enacting Israel's plans for Gaza. And really what they've come out and said is that this idea of a port, or trying to get the US to arm it, or private security contractors, it's really, it was an Israeli plan. They were proud of it. And again, they see this as part of their way of enacting more spatial control and in further dividing the territory. And again, they are trying to talk to the Biden administration about footing the bill for them. And so they really saw this as this kind of like golden opportunity. And here it's also kind of important to connect to other instances of if they were to succeed in getting these private security contractors to come in. Private security contractors working for the US government have done horrific things in other war zone areas. They were shooting civilians using excessive force in several incidents in Iraq and Afghanistan. In 2007, contractors working for Blackwater, who were supposed to be protecting a State Department convoy, fired on a crowd in Baghdad Square. We can really expect more of that. Again, the way we've seen these flower massacres unfold. And in terms of expecting accountability for these contractors, 4 were convicted in US courts on charges related to those deaths in Baghdad, but they were later pardoned by Trump. And this is, I don't even know if in the future they would allow this to happen again. And something else really to keep in mind about this kind of floating port, this idea of these ships coming in. There's talk of the UAE being involved in unloading the vessels. And really, again, we're talking about weeks in terms of these ships coming in, and US or the Israelis being allowed to take charge of the search of this aid in Cyprus, where these ships would be coming in, and at the port itself. And I think what is striking to me is we're talking about all this kind of time, 2 months to build this in order to bring in all this aid, and this amount of time for the ships to come in, when really what we're dealing with a situation, or we're seeing the US has been sending ships full of weapons every 3 days and multiple planes a day of weaponry. So again, there's always this smooth infrastructures, fast delivery of weaponry, but not of food or aid. And again, this is kind of even the idea of what we've been repeating, even in terms of the airdrops, for example. I think some well-meaning people thought, okay, airdrops are better than nothing, right? There were some activist organizations said before the airdrop started, let's do airdrops, like it's better than nothing. But really, again, we have these hundreds of trucks, and we're talking about an airdrop that will have the equivalent of one truck or less. Besides the fact that at least 5 people, including a child, were killed by the parachute failure of this aid, and just the kind of inefficiency, the intended humiliation of it. And on top of that, just hearing over and over again from people in Gaza saying, okay, so they're giving us some, scrap of really kind of what looks like expired airport meals or airplane meals, or, these military rations. And this is all so that we have to try to fight and maybe even pay someone who's hoarded them to get this aid. And all this is so that maybe we die on a full stomach if we get bombed. So I think that's kind of the summation of it. I think really what I always have in mind, or something that I think is a point to leave off of, is that we have to really push back against this idea that Netanyahu or what Israel wants in terms of these truck searches, and this is kind of this force of gravity that we all have to work around. And we're seeing the situation where they're basically being given everything they want, everything that they're asking for, secure in terms of security, in terms of aid, military aid. And we are supposed to accept this as the US trying its best, or at least it's something, and it's better than nothing. And this is something we just we have to push back against. It's not enough, and it doesn't. The amount of time, for example, according to the Israeli military themselves, I think per hour, or let's say per 2 hours, they can search 45 trucks. But okay, why? Especially when you even look into this kind of situation with Egypt, where a company headed by someone, Arjani, who has these close connections to Sisi's son, their trucks were supposed to not be up for searches. So so it's obviously not something that it's something that politically can be either speeded up or facilitated or just forced. This amount of trucks need to come in, or we stop sending these weapons every single day. And really, I think that's the note. There's about the corridor where this is supposed to be built. It's something to realize that this is why there has been a lot of resistance fighting in this area. And really just, again, trying to keep in mind that this is all supposed to be to try to set up some sort of clan ruling family, some sort of alternative to Hamas that can be controlled by the Israeli military, when really this is kind of the only group on the ground that is actually working in the interests of the people in the area, who've actually been trying to stop the hoarding of aid. There was a particular family found to have been hoarding really thousands of aid, and even shooting people to take flour and to hide it in warehouses. So this is what's going on. We kind of can expect more to unfold. And just a final thing is that in terms, because some people have the impression that this is all being done for gas. There is some to keep in mind about gas. There is a Gaza Marine natural gas field, and it was supposed to, something that should be able to power the Palestinian territories, but it's remained undeveloped because of Israel. I don't know if the port is part of that, because it feels like, frankly, they have other mechanisms that they could use besides this. But really, it seems like a way to get these kind of boots on the ground. There's even talks of this being kind of an alternative. Should a more large-scale war break out with Lebanon, this port could be an alternative to the Haifa port. It could even help with normalization with Saudi Arabia. So there's kind of more, there's these other reasons besides gas that I think we should keep in mind in terms of strategically and going forward, or even talks of closing down the Rafah crossing in the south permanently and having this be a way to ethnically cleanse Palestinians just out from that point. So that's what I have. And thank you for listening.
Thank you, Rawan and Fathi. Khululiwe and SERI, who unfortunately has to leave us a little early at 2021. Thanks, he's going to give us the perspective on spatial inequality and apartheid in Joburg.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, everyone. So I think, when I was listening to the presentation from my colleagues over there, I could draw a lot of similarities. And I think the South African context, broadly, with the legal system being a strong force of colonialism, really starts with the Natives Land Act, which was the act that came in 1913, if I'm not mistaken. The purpose of the act was to really limit the ownership of Black people to land and their ability to rent land. It initially started with allowing only 7% of ownership for Black people, which, if you look at the dynamics of the country, with Black people being making most of the population, it doesn't make sense. And what then this does is it creates a system where Black people are either limited to rural areas and coming to urban cities just only as migrants. And even in urban cities, they are located in areas far away from the city where they're able to get employment opportunities, where they work and where there's better resources such as water, sanitation, and education. And the end of apartheid means that that large group of people is still without land. And meant that you're gonna find people who are living in land that they're not legally allowed to live in because of the apartheid system that existed at the time. And now this is when you find the Constitution trying to, address the injustices of the past. SERI's work is mostly around Section 26 of the Constitution, which provides the right to housing, and in particular, Section 26(3) of the Constitution, which prevents an eviction without a court order. And what brings into life Section 26(3) of the Constitution is the PI Act. The PI Act was a direct substitution of the acts that came before it, which we call the PISA Act. That act, really, all you needed to prove in order to evict someone was that you own the land and the person is unlawfully occupying the land. It didn't matter what the circumstance of the person was, whether they'll be rendered homeless by the eviction or not. You could just evict them by using that piece of legislation. And now this is what the PI Act then tried to do, to ensure that we don't have these arbitrary evictions that we saw during the apartheid system, and which we saw even going into democracy. But now what this means is we still have lots of people who don't have land, who are not close to their places of employment. And coming into democracy with the, I think, what I usually term it is the uncertainty of what democracy would look like for the landowners, in particular in the city centers, the Joburg city centers. You have lots of property owners now leaving the buildings, leaving tenants with no caretaker, with no systems in place to take care of those buildings. And then the states of the buildings then deteriorate over time. And in the early 2000s, you've got this mass influx of evictions, people being evicted from the city centers because of the ideas that are now coming in of the gentrification of the city, wanting a city to look a particular way and to have a particular type of people. And in the city of Joburg, we have seen throughout different mayors, there's this common understanding of having a clean city. I mean, Joburg is termed as a world-class African city. And the idea behind a world-class African city is a city that does not have poor people, which consists of majority of Black people. It's a city that seeks to move them away from the city center and move them to areas where they are far away from employment opportunities and their places of work. Now, what this does is to, number one, create a lot of homelessness, displacement. It doesn't solve the problem, the housing crisis that we have, that has its origins in the apartheid legislations. It doesn't resolve it because you will find an eviction in one building. You're not gonna wish people away. People are just gonna move from one unlawful occupied building to another. It's as if unlawful occupation is being recycled instead of trying to deal with the crisis, the housing crisis in the inner city. There's no affordable housing in the inner city. There's no social housing in the inner city. And this is very necessary for the people who work in the city center, who find employment opportunities in the city center. And now, this is a system that is being created by the city of Joburg in particular. But we've had a different experience with the city of Cape Town. It makes the city of Joburg look like a better city in comparison, because in the city of Cape Town, there's a deliberate intention from the municipality to keep the system as it were during the apartheid system, where you have poor people living far away from the city. If you look at the private market and the private rentals in the city of Cape Town, they're very expensive. Even I can't afford them, and I'm gainfully employed. And in dealing with evictions, what the city has done is to say, and this is a recent case that was heard in the Constitutional Court in February, the city has taken a stance to say, we don't have to provide alternative accommodation in the city center. So if you are being evicted in the city center and you come to the city, or you say in court, you will be rendered homeless by the eviction, then we can send you some 40 kilometers away. There's nothing that obliges us to give you alternative accommodation in the city center. Now, that takes us again to the spatial planning that was created by apartheid. And it creates a lot of problems in terms of people who find employment in the city center. But I think what the apartheid spatial planning did is more than just push away people from the city centers. I mean, I think everyone knows South Africa is the most unequal country in the world. And usually when you hear that phrase, you will see a picture of a suburb, and then on the other side is an informal settlement. And this is because it was so carefully orchestrated. You need poor Black people away from the cities, but you also need them close enough in the suburbs so that they can be your precarious workers, your domestic workers, your informal traders, whatever you need them to do, but they can't leave where they work. And now that has created a space where you've got one side of a place where there's a reach of resources, good schools, water and science, access to everything essentially. And just less than 5 kilometers away, you have people living in abject poverty and below the poverty line. And there's nothing they're able to do to enrich themselves. The employment that they find on the better side of the area is just enough for them to go to work and to have something to eat, but not do anything more than that. And this is some of the work that over the years SERI has tried to deal with in relation to domestic workers. And what we have found in SERI's research is the mismatch, the spatial mismatch in the big metros, including the city of Joburg, which is where we litigate mostly. It reduces the employment opportunities. So the further you are away from the city, the less likely you are to find employment opportunities. And the more likely you are to live in abject poverty, which then becomes even a generational thing. It's difficult for a child born in such situations to make something of themselves. So it becomes generational. But there are exceptions to this finding, which is, I think, in our report of 2016 is the case of Diepsloot and Alexandra. If you look at those two areas, they're very, very poor, but they're close to the richest scale mile in Africa. And them being close to Sentin has not translated to having better access to services, better access to employment opportunities. So there's still that mismatch that has just been maintained despite being just a few kilometers away from the richest square mile in Africa. And so what SERI's work has focused on since its inception is to really try and prevent arbitrary evictions and unlawful evictions. And we've been involved in very key landmarking cases from the Constitutional Court that have established and enhanced the principle that if you are being evicted from your home and you're going to face homelessness as a result of that eviction, then the municipality where you're located then needs to provide you with alternative accommodation. Now, the problem that we've experienced with the city of Joburg in particular is that despite that landmarking decision from the Constitutional Court, which is now, I think, about 12 years old, the municipalities will only provide alternative accommodation if there's representation of the occupiers by one of the public interest law organizations. So we currently doing research on evictions mapping. We looked at two courts, the Joburg Magistrate Court and then the High Court in Joburg. The publication on the Joburg Magistrate Court is out, but we're still working on the High Court one. But the data that we're finding is there's no consideration of the personal circumstance of people who are being evicted in the matters that come to the High Court. And I think it's the most litigious High Court in the country. And because of Joburg's history, it has more people unlawfully occupying buildings, but you still have eviction orders coming out of that court as if there is no jurisprudence that seeks to safeguard against homelessness. And in the ones we've been able to find the personal circumstances being considered, the court ordering the municipalities to provide temporary emergency accommodation is only when public interest law organizations such as ourselves are involved in that litigation. And I mean, our capacity is finite. We're not able to take even half or even a quarter of the cases that go to the Joburg High Court. So you can only imagine what that means. It means we're having evictions as if there is no 20-year-long jurisprudence that seeks to safeguard against homelessness. And what then this translated to is what we saw last year, at the end of August, beginning of September, the fire in Marshalltown in the Osindiso building. In the cases that we deal with the city of Joburg, they will only provide the temporary alternative accommodation because we're there, and we're there to consistently go back to court to force them to do that. And once they've done that, it's sort of like we had to comply with the order, yeah, done by. There's no maintenance of the buildings. There's no security in the buildings, which then lead to people, the state of the building deteriorating and people doing as they wish in the building, people who are not even initially allocated into such a building for temporary accommodation. And that is the story of Usindiso Shelter. Usindiso Shelter was a shelter that was meant for abused women and children. It's owned by the city, it's managed by the city, but it states this got to such a point that the city had no control, had no idea who's in the land. There's a report that they came up with, which we found out when the fire happened around 2018, that the building is hijacked and by whom it's hijacked. That was not followed through because we've got a recalcitrant and stiff-necked city that will only do something when it's being taken to court. And what we then saw with the fire was then blame shifting. The city saying, we're not doing these things because every time we try to move people from these bad buildings, then organizations such as SERI then take us to court, which I mean is a complete lie because number one, we act on behalf of the unlawful occupiers to ensure that they're not rendered homeless by the eviction, which the city, I mean, does not care about. The more eviction orders there are, the better for it. During the tenure of Mayor Herman Mashaba, his whole stand was to try and get unlawfully occupied buildings to be evacuated so that they can be given to the private sector for the private markets. There doesn't seem to be any plan for affordable housing or social housing in the city of Joburg, which then leaves us with the predicament that we're in. Usindiso was the first of many buildings which are not in a good state. A lot of buildings in the inner city, there's no services, the buildings are bad, and I'm just talking about the city-owned buildings, not even talking about the buildings that are privately owned. But even with the privately owned buildings, the city has bylaws that give it power to try and attend to those situations. Even outside the bylaws, the buildings that are privately owned, the private ownership does not stop the city from providing basic services to the people. But we consistently see the city not trying to resolve the issue that's created by the apartheid spatial planning and just trying to reinforce apartheid and say people must go. And one matter that there was a fire a week after the Marshalltown fire, a block away from the Usindiso shelter. And the city offered alternative accommodation near Mall of the South. It's 25 kilometers away from the city center. There are no schools. There's nothing. It was just open land. And the only reason why the municipality did not ultimately provide the alternative accommodation was because it was close to a private estate, and the residents of the estate refused. And they said, no, you're not going to have these people coming here because crime statistics and all of these things. And that's the only reason why the city did not move people there. And I think for South Africa, because of how we obtained our democracy and with the constitution that we have, we've become very litigious in enforcing socioeconomic rights. It's almost as if we have to go to court to get enforcement of these rights. And it has worked very well for us over the years. But in the last few years, we've seen a decline in terms of how the judiciary approaches these rights and how the judiciary sees poor people. The case that I'm talking about where the city had provided accommodation 25 kilometers away, the city said to the court, they need to find land that is near the city because people are currently near the city. Children go to school in the city. And it was the court that said, no, you don't have to do that. You just only need to provide them with alternative accommodation or wherever that is. And we've seen more and more of those in court as we go and defend evictions, whether on urgent court or normal court basis. We're seeing a reluctance, particularly in the Joburg High Court, from the judges to enforce what we already have, the rich jurisprudence that we already have. It's as if there's this understanding that poor people are the cause of the fire, because the experience we've had in court since the fire, the Marshalltown fire, has been very horrible, and it directly affects the people who are living in these buildings, and what happens to them. Since the fire, the city has found land, which I think is about 10 kilometers away from the city. It's in an industrial area. There are no schools there. There's no water, there's no sanitation. The land was not properly prepared. When there's not even too much heavy rains, the rains go inside the shacks, all of it. And that's what people have to deal with. The city has complied and it just becomes that. So I think what we've been trying to advocate for, even our participation in the commission, is to get the commission to see the city's failure in taking care of its profits is in the inner city, but in also just having a plan for alternative accommodation, not just in the inner city, because they're also failing when it comes to upgrading informal settlements, which are outside of the inner city. Because what has become a thing since the Marshalltown fire is victim blaming. The victims are being blamed for the state of the building and everything that has gone wrong. But there's no accountability from the city. There's no plan that is required from the city. And hopefully we can get the city to have a proper plan and finding housing near where people work and where there are employment opportunities. And that is why SERI also, on behalf of Abahlali baseMjondolo, which is one of our partner organizations based in Durban, we then became amicus in the city of Cape Town matter that was heard in the Constitutional Court, because you can't have a city and the courts endorsing the city to say, we don't have to house you in the inner city. We can send you far away from the city if you want to. And yeah, I think I'll end there because I'm also rushing elsewhere. Thank you so much.
Thanks. I think the last speaker giving the input for today is Rashid. Yeah, so I'll set up your presentation there. I just also want to remind everyone that at 1:15 we'll be going over to a rally that is organized by the Wits PSC in the Wits main amphitheater. So that's at 1:15.
Oh, share, screen share. Maybe just make Tara a host. That's the easiest thing.
Some over there, the kind of circles over there. So let me just say that this, yeah, okay, I'll show you if it, yeah, I think it's fine. And you want to put it in
I'm just gonna unmute the. Yeah. There we go.
Yeah, so maybe the first thing to say is that actually 12 years ago, in fact, and you can see on the picture, it says the 27th to the 29th of March, which is actually almost exactly 12 years ago. I was actually in Ramallah at something called the Palestinian Urban Forum. It's part of a series of discussions that are held throughout the world in the build up to the World Urban Forum that UN Habitat organizes every 2 years. And interestingly enough, well, we also had two participants, well, a number of participants from South Africa, including the then mayor of Joburg, Park Stow, and not Herman Mashaba, and the then deputy minister of Kokta, Yunus Karim. And just to say that all of us were unanimous about one thing, and that was that it was worse than apartheid in South Africa, what we had seen. There's no two ways about that. And all of us were activists and grew up under apartheid. I mean, knew what it was like. And in fact, Park Stow said that on many public platforms while he was speaking to her in Palestine at the time. It was a very interesting debate because what he really spoke to was, what is the possibility of the desirability of spatial transformation in the context of occupation? Can you really do it? And actually, we had very similar debates in the late 1980s, particularly. I was an urban planning student, in fact, around that time, year at Wits.
And the question was that, I mean, under a oppressive system, can you actually effect fundamental change? Of course you can't. But do you ameliorate the conditions of people living in these places, or do you allow the contradictions, as revolutionists would say, to heighten, so that you actually get people to participate more in the struggle? And I think that those are very sort of fundamental questions that I'm sure confront our almost colleagues, but I'll say our comrades from Palestine. And of course, I mean, there are no easy answer to those questions. I don't intend to deal with those things here, but I think they remain, I think, quite important. What I'm going to talk about is what I've been asked to talk about, which is some of the apartheid spatial policies and practices in South Africa, and also where we are today in relation to the legacy of apartheid. Now, this is moving. I'm not sure why my slide is not moving. I've been pressing, oh, that one, okay, sorry. Okay, so, Khululiwe spoke about some of the laws that underpin spatial apartheid. And actually, in a way, there were two big things that happened so, I mean, you were speaking about your dozens of laws. We had, over the course of the colonial period, before Union of South Africa, up to now, a list of dozens and dozens of oppressive laws, not in general, I mean, specifically in relation to spatial kind of issues and racially based separation. And of course, what I have here is just really even less than a top slice. I mean, I'm sure somebody like Noor can tell us a lot more about that. But suffice to say that the establishment of the Bantustans, through initially by setting aside land through the Native Lands the Black Land Act, or the Native Lands Act of 1913, and the Native Urban Areas Act, and then much later the passage of the Group Areas Act, and that set the basis for the kind of spatial apartheid that we saw in later time. And this is one example of a kind of comparison that was spoken about. So on the one hand, you see the Bantustan territories on the left of your screen. For example, Bophuthatswana in multiple pieces. So if you're around at the time, by the way, Bophuthatswana was one of the so-called TBVC states, Transkei, Bophuthatswana, Venda, and Ciskei, that actually got nominal independence. Not unlike what they said Gaza actually had a couple of years ago. But fully under the control of the apartheid regime. And most of the other Bantustans at the time were similarly fragmented. And you can see in a way, in a kind of contrast, a similarity beginning to emerge, or has emerged over the course of the occupation. The diagram on the left was developed by an academic in the 1980s. It's a good sort of representation of the idea behind the Group Areas Act. So in any so-called white town or city, what you'll see is basically different localities that are set aside for different racial groups. And of course, the levels of income would differ. So certainly African townships will be very low income, colored and Indian somewhere in between. And then amongst whites, at the top of that particular diagram, you'll have very wealthy areas, middle income areas, and even so-called working class areas. And of course, the tax base was fundamentally located in the white areas. Of course, not dissimilar to what we see in the West Bank at the moment, with the growth of settlements and outposts. Again, I think something that's well known to this particular audience. So, what were some of the impacts of the application of spatial segregation? What you see on the map on the right-hand side is basically what this part of the world, what's now Gauteng, it used to be called the PWV region of the old Transvaal, So include Pretoria, the Witwatersrand, including Johannesburg at the center, and the Vaal or the Vereeniging kind of complex in the south, close to the Vaal River. That was this kind of emerging, what we shall explain, has kind of developed into a city region. But what were the impacts? Impacts destroyed vibrant mixed communities. Sophiatown, Fitas in Johannesburg, District 6 in Cape Town, and of course that throughout the country you saw that. Violent forced removals. But I should tell you, Fathi, that actually they always paid for the bulldozers and the trucks that remove people in South Africa, right? So, that's why I say it is always worse there than it is here. But I mean, my family, for example, will move from Newlands here into Indonesia. I know my friend Ismail, exactly, his family in exactly the same situation. And if you look around, I'm sure you'll see that that kind of thing reproduced amongst Black people, in the generations that preceded us. And I think it's really important to talk about the pass laws. I mean, the Dompas. I mean, that was a really pernicious, evil instrument. If you're an African person and you were in an urban area and you were on demand asked by policemen to produce your pass and you didn't, you're subject to arbitrary arrest, even though you may have had it. You need section, 1C rights, I think, Noor, or something like that. But I mean, those are the sorts of, and if you didn't have those rights for which you had to apply for because you had a job, but actually you belonged to the Bantustans, you were a temporary sojourner. That was the term they used. In other words, you were just here to work, and then when you were old and decrepit, you had to be shifted off back to die in the Bantustans. So that was one of the instruments to effect spatial apartheid. But what did it do? It basically imprinted a fragmented and dysfunctional urban system that created wealthy white towns and cities, dormitory townships for poor Black communities who had to commute long distances to access job opportunities. So, okay, right now, fast forward to where we are. As you know, we now have, after the 1996 Constitution, we have 9 provinces. Gauteng is one of them. And one of the, and this is what I'm just going to focus on a little bit. So just to orient you, I mean, everyone knows where Gauteng is, but the thick black outer line is basically the provincial boundary. The internal lines are the municipal boundaries, the metros, districts, metros and local municipalities. And then beyond that is basically the periphery of Gauteng. But we call it a city region because the articulation between what is on the outside, for example, in the platinum mines of Rustenburg, the coal mines of Emalahleni, and just across the river in Cecilburg, is basically part of one urban system. So, but Gauteng as it stands, I mean, this is what the population looks like. It grew in 1996. I remember doing work for the city of Joburg. We were less than 8 million Gauteng at the time. We are now sitting at 15 million in the 2022 census. So in less than 30 years, remember from 1996 to 2022, we basically grew, over that time. Very substantially. We used to be something like 19%. Okay, the boundaries did change and so on, but in broad terms, they've remained the same to almost a quarter of the country's population. And South Africa was 40 million around democracy in 1994. We're now sitting at 62 million. So you can see we've grown very substantially. If you take Britain, for example, I mean, Britain was in that sort of 50, 60 million, 10, 15 years ago. They haven't grown, even though they complain endlessly. And France also, right, about migration and so on. But you can see how we've actually grown, and Gauteng as well. This is the profile of the cities, and our cities also grow very substantially. There's only one thing that really puzzles us about the census. Is that number for Joburg and our percentage growth of 8.3% in Joburg. We don't quite believe it. We think something might have gone wrong because it looks like, I mean, all the adjacent areas have grown in the late 20s, late teens and early 20s. But nevertheless, I think this is the picture of what Gauteng has grown over time. So what has happened? in terms of the spatial picture that we see. The growth is expanding the urban footprint of Gauteng. And of course, you can see from, we have 1990, the gray areas you see in the picture there, that's what it looked like before. And from, into 2010 and up to 2020, that is basically the expansion. If you zoom in, what you will see is that most of the expansion basically happened around township areas, and some of the new developments like Diepsloot and Orange Farm are more recent developments. They're not historic townships like Soweto and Alex and Mamelodi and so on. Okay, and of course, some development around historically white areas. And I just move this thing here. So yeah, I'm going to leave that and move on to the next slide. Oops. Yeah. Okay. I mean, these aerial photographs are always amazing. If you look at what happened between 2011 and 2022 in Mamelodi, which is a historic black township, you'll see how the infill is basically beginning to happen. What you can't see actually is an intensification of land uses, particularly in the form of backyard shacks. Now, of course, Steyn City, which is at the other end of the spectrum, you can also see how well developed that is. You can see the infrastructure that has been inserted and so on. And you can see the emergence of green spaces to the south of that development. I did speak about backyard shacks, but I think it's important to say that there has been a densification of the urban footprint of Gauteng, driven by backyard shacks, but also cluster housing developments, particularly adjacent to historic white suburbs. And this is how it now looks. And what you can see in the dark blue or the black is basically townships. That's Soweto, as you know. That's Tembisa, a very important development around the Vaal townships, around Orange Farm, and the Katoris townships here in the south of Ekurhuleni. The other thing to look at is that is basically the issue about whether or not we become racially diverse. The answer is no. Okay, I mean the short answer. So if you look at this particular, this thing has sort of come in the way, I suppose. Let me just try and move it. If you zoom into these things, what you basically see is that they've essentially remained the same over time. I'm not going to go into that due to time, but that's what our analysis, and these are maps that the GCRO has actually produced. And then as far as what we call a socioeconomic risk index, in other words, people at risk of multidimensional poverty. And again, you can see if you do an overlay, clearly the historic areas, the black areas which were segregated under apartheid, basically have the highest risks. Again, you can see Soweto, Tembisa, etc. This is zooming in. So if you look at the central Gauteng, that's Diepsloot. Khululiwe spoke about Diepsloot and places like that. You can see the kind of the poverty levels there, the poverty levels in Tembisa. Yes, well located, but not historically well located. It's because of the knitting together of the urban system in Gauteng that they suddenly, somewhere like a place like Diepsloot, emerging in the late 80s, early 90s as an idea of the old Transvaal provincial administration. And at that time, it was actually in the periphery. But as the whole urban system grew, it ended up suddenly becoming actually central. So it wasn't by design at all. It was actually how it sort of emerged. But you can see how that contrasts with the northern suburbs of Johannesburg. Again, as far as unemployment is concerned, a very similar picture, which I'm not going to go through. The issues, the spatial dislocation that this causes in relation to commuting is a big problem. So if you live out in township areas, it takes you much longer to get to work than if you live in a suburban area. I mean, this is something, you know, issue around green vegetation, impervious surfaces. We want to avoid impervious surfaces to avoid sort of like runoff of water and so on. But what if you zoom in, which I'm not going to do, if you look at a place like Saint, it's like pretty green. Look at Alex is actually the opposite. So what is the conclusion? The conclusion of all of this is that, yes, colonial apartheid spatial policies over more than 100 years imprinted a dislocated urban form. The urban core was wealthy and white, and the periphery was poor and black. We have to note there has been a substantial demographic growth, but there have been some significant shifts, and I'm saying not fundamental changes. So before I get attacked in the discussion, the urban morphology of Gauteng has changed, has shifted. We now have deracialized gated estates, and there is scholarly work on that, which shows that there's some graying of former white areas and intensification of backyard shacks, and what I should have said, the proliferation of informal settlements in particular parts in the northwest and the southwest of Gauteng in particular. So there has been the so-called increased densification, right, which urban planners love, but I mean, it's always not in the best sort of way that we would like. Unfortunately, our post-apartheid policies in general and in relation to spatial transformation have been very problematic. And as a public servant in the city of Joburg for 16 years and in Gauteng province for 10 years, so over a quarter of a century as a public servant, we failed. So I'm saying that openly. I don't believe in being defensive about these things. But what we do have to understand is that how on earth are we going to change this thing? I mean, so that, I mean, there are a number of opportunities. One minor one, for example, is the white paper on human settlements that the National Department of Human Settlements has put forward. It's actually pretty bad, by the way. But how do we fix that and make sure that we move on? So that's a kind of picture. But I wanted to sort of conclude on this, which I thought was really interesting for me. In 1986, there was a book called Two Dogs and Freedom. I don't know if some of you remember this thing, right? Oh, I see at least one person. And it was based on, it was the cover art entitled of this book by young children from townships were basically under occupation as well. There was occupation townships, by the way, and by the army, and they were asked to talk about the vision for the future. And this one young chap said, "I want a house, a wife, 2 dogs, and freedom." I thought that was like really, and the name of the book is Two Dogs and Freedom. Like, it was absolutely. And this was in 1986, so it was 8 years before democracy and 4 years before the transition. But then I saw this piece of artwork done also by a student at the conference I attended at Najai University. And I mean, there wasn't a caption in Arabic, and of course I can only, like Muslim kids can read Arabic, but don't understand it. I'm still in non-Arab world. Certainly in my generation, I see some young people here who might be able to, but anyway, the drawing was displayed at this thing. And but the interesting thing is that if you look at the similarities, both have pictures of the sun rising, one a new dawn, the other one a bright sun, pictures of birds. In other words, you know, some real sort of green spaces, and an urban system. And the one on the right, guy, you know, this one says two dogs and freedom. This person is walking 1 dog, but it's, I mean, we all have the same vision of what we're looking for. And I suppose the only thing to say is, you know, we really look forward to an equal South Africa and a free Palestine. And these are some of the pics of my time in Palestine at the time. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. My apologies due to the rally that we want to get our guests over to, and also maybe get over to ourselves. It looks like we don't have any time for discussion. What I'm going to suggest is that, because I think this is very generative in terms of discussion and thinking about building solidarity around dismantling spatial apartheid in both South Africa and Palestine, that we carry over this conversation to the rally itself and also to the event that's taking place tomorrow at UJ. So tomorrow at UJ, Fathi and Rawan will again be speaking, and there'll be an opportunity to talk further about solidarities. And it's taking place at 1 p.m. tomorrow at UJ. The venue is Cottage 3, if people want to take this down, and we're also spreading it on the various networks. Research Village, UJ Bunting Road. So Cottage 3, Research Village, UJ Bunting Road. Another suggestion that I'll make is that we have a follow-up conversation, even if it's on Zoom, about this issue of spatial apartheid in particular. So I'd invite you all to join us in that. And apologies again for running late and not having time for discussion. Thank you very much for joining us. Amazing.